So now we have a basic understanding of the fundamentals of intermolecular forces. We're going to look at how these things affect the properties of liquids. So if we consider a substance like water, it's got many interesting properties. Water is commonly found in the solid, liquid, and gaseous state under sort of fairly modest conditions on our planet. We've already explained how water can dissolve oxygen, and that means that we can have a thriving ecosystem in aqueous solution that exists in our atmospheres. But some things are like sort of kind of a little weird to understand that we haven't really dealt with yet. Like, how does water make it to the top of a giant, Douglas fir or sequoia tree or something like that, when clearly this tree, it doesn't have a heart pumping that water? Somehow the water gets to the very top of that tree, even though there are no moving parts. So there are lots of interesting things about liquids that it would be nice to be able to understand, and it seems that they're probably related to intermolecular forces in one way or another. One of the first manifestations of intermolecular forces that we're going to look at is the idea of surface tension. Is given the Greek letter gamma to indicate surface tension, and that's the resistance that a liquid has to increasing its surface area. And it's given in terms of the energy required to produce 1 meter squared of surface area. Now you might ask, why does it take energy to make a surface? Well, when you look at a particle that is not at the surface, that's in a liquid, there are attractive forces acting on it in all three dimensions: forwards, backwards, upwards, downwards, everywhere, right? But when you look at when you take a particle and you bring it to the surface, you have to break a whole bunch of intermolecular forces in order to make that happen. And then half of those, a lot of those intermolecular forces are not going to be reformed. So you don't get that energy back. That is, in order to form a surface, or in order to bring a molecule to the surface and turn it from being in the bulk to being in the surface, you have to break some interparticle forces, and as a result, that costs energy. Now, water has a fairly high surface tension, 7.2 by 10 to the minus 2 joules per meter squared, and the reason for that is because water possesses fairly strong hydrogen bonds between its molecules. Now, as a result of surface tension, liquids tend to form shapes that minimize their surface area. So this is often referred to as the Lotus Effect. When you have a waxy leaf, you see these spherical drops of water sitting on it. Even there's these tiny little ones in there, and it's not just these big drops that form that shape. And that's an attempt to reduce the amount of surface that is being formed. When water drips from a tap or a faucet, you'll see the same thing. It tries to form a spherical drop as quickly as possible to reduce its surface area. So as a result of forces between molecules at the surface of a liquid, this surface tension often manifests with the surface of the liquid acting like an elastic sheet. And so some interesting things can happen, even though this needle that is sitting on the surface of this liquid has higher density than the liquid, it floats because in order for it to sink, it'd have to make more surface. Interparticle forces would have to be broken. And some critters take advantage of that, these like little water striders. Even though the strider is perhaps more dense than the water, it can walk across the water because it would take so much energy to break the interparticle forces for it to sink that it just doesn't have enough gravitational potential energy to do that. So that's kind of one manifestation of a property of liquids that results from, or one manifestation of the intermolecular forces that are present in liquids is this idea of surface tension. Something else that results from the intermolecular forces that are present in liquids is the formation of what we call a meniscus. Now, you've probably seen already that when we have an aqueous solution in a glass container, that it has a concave meniscus where it kind of curves down, and at the edges of the tube, the liquid kind of rises up a little bit. It kind of just rises up a little bit there. So to explain this, we're going to talk about what we call cohesive and adhesive forces. So cohesive forces are those that exist between the particles of the liquid, and then adhesive forces are those that exist between the particles of the liquid and its container. Now, in this case, what's the container is silica, it's glass, and what we've got is silicon and oxygen bound together. We're going to talk about how that is. So it's not silicon bound to silicon, it's sort of in this pattern. It turns out that every silicon atom is bound to 4 oxygens, and every oxygen is bound to 2 silicons, but we'll get there and we'll talk about that later. And these adhesive forces are between the water molecules and the silica. And because the adhesive forces are stronger than the cohesive forces, you see this concave meniscus where it rises up, where the silica is pulling the liquid up the sides of the tube. Now, not every meniscus is concave. Some are convex, and a good example of this is Mercury. And so what is happening here is that the cohesive forces in Mercury are stronger than the adhesive forces between the mercury and the glass. So the mercury is getting kind of pulled inwards towards the bulk, and it's getting, and the glass just can't keep it at the edges, right? So you end up with this convex meniscus. So you always have to think about the forces between the liquid and itself, and the forces between the liquid and the container. All right. So I hope that makes sense. Now, there's an interesting phenomena called capillary rise, and it has the same origins as what we were talking about with forming a meniscus. And if you have a narrow tube containing an aqueous solution, what you'll find is that a narrow tube that is placed into an aqueous solution, what you'll find is that the liquid will rise up that tube. And so why is that happening? Well, it's a result of the adhesive forces between the tube and the water molecules. And if this tube is narrow enough, then they can pull a significant amount of liquid up the tube. And so you might have done this yourself. Rock climbers use this phenomenon of the adhesive forces between the walls of what's called a chimney and themselves in order to rise up that chimney. So you just kind of push outwards a little bit and you sort of get stuck, and you can do it yourself in the doorway if you want. You just push with your hands and your arms, and you can actually kind of rise up a doorway. The narrower the tube, the more the greater rise that you will get. There is a formula given in the book, but we're not going to be doing any math on this. So this is kind of very, very important for living organisms, because this is how fluid is going to be moved around in living things that don't have hearts. They have tiny, tiny little channels, and fluids can move through them. So a tree doesn't need a heart because it can rely on this kind of action. So this is often demonstrated by using something like celery and putting it into a colored liquid, and you can see that the capillary rise results in the blue liquid here rising up that piece of celery like quite a long way, because the tubes that are in this are very, very, very narrow. And so organisms use this all the time to move fluids around within their system. It's sometimes referred to as capillary action or capillary rise. They're really the same thing, and it's very often used in plants to move fluids around, but it's also used in things like unicellular organisms that don't have any hearts and things like that. Okay, So now the final property of liquids that we're going to be talking about is viscosity, which is the resistance to flow of a liquid. And it's a pretty simple kind of idea that as the intermolecular forces increase, so will viscosity, or the resistance to flow. So, if you have a molecule, you can have a look at it, think about its intermolecular forces, and you can probably make a guess as to what its viscosity is likely to be. For nonpolar molecules, the general rule of thumb is that viscosity will increase with molecular weight because of the presence of dispersion forces. So that kind of makes it easy. When you have a polar molecule, you have the possibility of all of those other kinds of forces coming in. So, maybe there's hydrogen bonding, and maybe there's dipole if there's not hydrogen bonding. And so it kind of becomes, and if there is hydrogen bonding, maybe one molecule has more lone pairs than the other. So it kind of becomes a little bit tricky for polar molecules to kind of rank their relative intermolecular forces. There are some guidelines though. Here are a series of molecules here. They're all polar. They all have this OH group. They can all hydrogen bond, right? But what we see is that they all have this sort of non-polar part to them as well. But the non-polar part is increasing as we move left to right. So what we would expect is that these are getting heavier, right? And they're getting this longer and longer carbon-hydrogen, or what we call hydrocarbon chain in each case, and this can interact via dispersion forces. So what I would expect as I come across here is that, they're all polar molecules that have hydrogen bonding, but they're increasing in molecular weight as I go across the sequence. So I would expect that dispersion forces would increase, and therefore viscosity will increase. And that's exactly what we see, right? Is as we go across the sequence, they're becoming more and more viscous. Methanol is kind of, it's really runny. It's even less runny than water, even more runny than water. Butanol is kind of starting to get seriously sort of like oily. It's very sort of, it's not quite honey, but it's definitely sort of, approaching olive oil viscosity. And then by the time you get to octanol, it's really thick and gloopy. So, that's a good example of, if you're given the Lewis diagram, you can make a pretty good stab at what its viscosity will be. Water has a pretty high viscosity. That's not really that surprising because we have the potential for hydrogen bonding, right? So hydrogen bonding is always going to increase boiling point and viscosity. Some other general properties of liquids is that as you decrease the temperature, you will increase the density. So as you decrease the temperature, the molecules slow down more. They're more likely to capture other molecules via sort of intermolecular forces, and they just don't have enough kinetic energy to break those intermolecular forces, so the molecules get sort of drawn in towards one another as a result of that. This sort of increase in density with decreasing temperature is also true for water up to a point. So here's the temperature and it's decreasing, and you see that the water becomes more and more dense until 4 degrees Celsius, and when you cool beyond 4 degrees Celsius, it actually becomes less dense, which is really kind of a little bit unusual. So 10 degrees Celsius, cool it down, it's becoming more and more dense. You hit 4, continue to cool it, and it actually becomes less dense. That's kind of interesting, and it has some profound consequences for the environment. So if you consider like what happens in a lake, as water cools down, it becomes more dense and it sinks, continues to cool, becomes less dense, and rises. All right, which is really interesting, and then eventually it'll freeze. And so what have we got on here? We've got the more dense stuff under here, which is actually the stuff that is greater than 4 degrees Celsius. So what does that mean? Well, we get this turnover, right? The water cools, it sinks, it continues to cool, it rises, and that brings nutrients up from the bottom of our lake, and that keeps everything fertile. It also means that it never gets that cold at the bottom of our lake, and everybody can kind of continue to live happily down the bottom here, and all of the greenery on the bottom of our lake doesn't get killed off because it gets too cold. So that's kind of really interesting how that works for water. In the very first slide, we saw that ice, solid water, is actually less dense than liquid water, and that's interesting as well. So when you continue to cool water down, once it gets to 0, it'll start to freeze. And what we find is that when it freezes, the density drops even further, and frozen water, ice, is less dense than liquid water. And so as a result, ice floats on water, which is really cool because it would be a disaster if our oceans froze at the bottom, because that would mean that every time we got down to 0 degrees Celsius, the bottom of the ocean or the bottom of our lake, all of the plants would be just frozen in ice, and everything would die. So that wouldn't be very good at all. So why does this happen? Well, when we cool the water down to its freezing point, everything slows down, and the atoms and the molecules are able to maximize their hydrogen bonding capacity. And if you recall, the oxygen atom in water is sp2 hybridized, so that means that it has tetrahedral geometry, and so we're going to end up with a tetrahedral geometry around each water molecule. And when we get down to a structure where we actually maximize the potential for hydrogen bonding, where every oxygen atom is forming 2 covalent bonds and 2 hydrogen bonds, we end up with tetrahedral geometry around each oxygen atom, and that leaves big hollows in the structure. So by maximizing the hydrogen bonding capacity, you actually reduce the density. And so as a result, the solid water is less dense than liquid water. Now, this is really cool because it does things like give a habitat to critters to live on the ice. Things like polar bears and seals can live on floating sea ice. It also means, as I mentioned previously, that the ocean doesn't freeze up from the bottom, it freezes with a thin layer of ice on the top, so you can have a fully functioning ecosystem existing below the sea ice. Sea ice also plays an important role in moderating our climate. You might have noticed that ice is white, and ice also tends to form in places where it snows a lot, which adds to the whiteness. And then this floating sea ice acts to reflect solar radiation and stops that heat from getting absorbed by the ocean and moderates the temperature of our planet. This is called albedo. So people are concerned because when the sea ice disappears, all of that incident solar radiation gets absorbed by the ocean, and no one really knows what that might do.